little bit clearer about our terms. So what is first real RAM? Random access memory is all about being low latency. When trying to find your data, you get it and you get it quick. Another thing about RAM, which is not so nice, is that it's not persistent. What that means is that after you shut down your computer, it's gone. That data is gone. So how does an operating system use RAM then? Specifically, it uses a caching layer. So that means that it's temporary. You put the data in there, but if you want something stored forever, you put it in a file and you store it on disk. So what is EOS RAM? EOS RAM is not real RAM. EOS RAM is all about blockchain consensus state. So what this means is that the state, like your account, how many EOS tokens you have, how many wizards you have, this is all consensus state. And what that means is that every node on the network has a copy of that, and it keeps it as data. So this is user-defined data or contract-defined data, or however you want to call it. But it's important to note that all the nodes have it. It's persistent and it's consistent. That means that no matter where you are, you can always access that data, and it's a consistent state, immutable by the blockchain, only mutable by yourself or the key or the one that can access it to change it. So now we know a little bit about the RAM differences. Let's talk about actual data stored properties. So we have physical memory, which is real RAM. This has the low latency access, but it's not persistent, and as we know, it's a high cost per gigabyte. We have physical disks, which are kind of the opposite. They're a high latency to access when you want to store something, but it's persistent. It'll remain there basically forever or until the disk dies. And it's a low cost, so you can have tons of data stored on disk, and it's cheap and easy. EOS RAM has this desire to kind of fit in the middle. It wants that low latency access of the real RAM, but it needs that persistence, and we desire that low cost per gigabyte. So how does EOS currently accomplish this? Right now, what we use is this thing called chain-based. This is the underlying data storage layer of EOS, and it uses these memory mapped files. What these files are, it's persistent data. It's this disk-based file that's also pinned into memory. So it gives you a bit of the advantages of both. The data is loaded and written and used from RAM, but it's also flushed to disk. So that means that when you quit the program or restart, you still have the data as a file. So if you know a little bit about memory files, you'll kind of know to recognize them as they're almost virtual memory. So what is virtual memory? Well, it's this idea of having a swap file. And this swap file allows you to move real memory back to disk. It's exactly what's happening with the memory mapped files. So when would you want to use this? Well, you have this non-persistent data and it needs to be stored in memory, but maybe you don't have enough real memory. So this is why we use this technique of virtualization. And the reason why this was actually created is specifically to avoid accidents. Actually, when two different programs were running at the same time, one wanted to use all the memory and the other one would have been kicked out and crashed. So the operating system, instead of just crashing that program, it'll instead kick it out to disk and use a policy like least recently used in order to do that, in order to swap that data out. Applications themselves, they can also define some characteristics, and that'll allow you to move data to disk as you choose. So can we use virtual memory in EOS? And now specifically what I mean, because we are using this type of virtual memory, this memory mapped file, I mean using more data than actually we have RAM. So that means you will be using the swapping feature. And the answer is yes, but at a cost. There's always a cost. So what is that cost? Well, the cost is an attacker can really screw things up. So what an attacker can do is if they know you're using swap, they can attack it by using the inverse of the caching policy. So what that means is if they know certain data is on disk, they'll write a transaction that will try to access it. It'll make your computer pull that data into RAM from disk, kicking out something else. And they can do that in a loop. And worst part is that you can't actually determine if this is a malicious transaction or not, because the only way to validate that transaction is to get the data first. So they will screw you over, thrash your nodes, and destroy them, make them completely unusable, and for free, because none of their transactions even have to be valid. they'll do this in a loop and they'll make two nodes go unsynchronized. One will have this data in RAM, the other one will have that data in disk, and totally screw things up. So how are we going to actually avoid that? How can we use virtual memory in EOS while avoiding an attack? In my proposal, the way to do this is to separate the two properties, to keep the notion of RAM and disk separate and not try to mix the two things up. So how do we do this? First of all, the only data that we allow to be loaded into RAM is when we know we're actually going to use it. How do we enforce that? The user has to pay in advance. And when I say pay, I don't actually mean pay in EOS or pay in some token. What I mean is it'll use the same renewable resources that you're already used to, like CPU. So you have some allotment of CPU time that you share and that recovers. You will use this as well in order to pay in advance for memory time, for time that you can access your data, the liveness of your data. But your data is always stored. It's always persistent, just like it is now on disk and when it's not used. So what are the pros and cons of moving over to a system like this? On the bright side, persistent data is really cheap. That means that we could support billions of accounts and billions of apps easily. There's no more RAM market, which means no speculation. But actually, that means that speculation moves back to EOS, so it's better for all the EOS token holders. Okay, so what are the downsides? No property rights over fast access anymore. You have to share. That means that you have to share your time in RAM. You can't always access your data. You can't purchase the right to do that anymore. It means that you are basically rate limited from changing your data too often according to how many EOS you have. And as a potential con, if you're a RAM speculator, you're not going to like this because this gets rid of the RAM market. So how bad would rate limiting be? You hear rate limiting and you think, oh no, I'm not going to be able to use my account all the time. But the reality is, how often do you actually expect to use your data? In the current system, we've set the RAM to be the same as the disk for the memory map file. So disk equals RAM. The actual allowed usage is that you can access all your data, every block, every single block. But the only amount of accounts that we can support in this case is 25 million. It's not a lot. So what would happen if we say, okay, share, interleave your accounts. You can access half your data every block and the other half on the next block perhaps, but half. So that means that your RAM is now backed by twice as much disk. That would allow you to support twice as many accounts, 50 million. And you don't have to interleave this way half your data. You could do it the opposite. You could do all your data once every other block, right? So every second, instead of every half second, you can access all your data. The same properties apply. But we really want to scale, right? So how about let's pump those numbers up. If you only access your data once every minute, you could interleave 3 billion accounts. And that would only require a 7 terabyte disk, which you can get. Every node owner would only have to pay like $200 to get one of these drives. They're cheap. Persistent data is cheap. It's the RAM that's the problem. So 120 times the RAM backed on disk. Do you really need to use all your data, all 4 kilobytes of data every minute? Maybe you're just transferring EOS tokens? Probably not. And the more that you leave, the more room for other people there are. It's all about that interleaving. And finally, because there's no more RAM market, upgrading RAM doesn't profit anything. All it does is allow more usage of the system. So if we, in these last two parts here, we upgrade the RAM just by doubling it, but keep the same amount of data. It means we keep the same amount of accounts, but we allow everyone to access their data twice as often. So 3 billion accounts, all your data once every 30 seconds, that doesn't sound too bad to me. It's a lot more accounts than we can currently support and no more RAM market. That's all I have time for today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you'd like to read the full proposal, that's on Steemit. You can find it at Grandmass on Steemit. I am at NEX on Steemit. And you can also feel free to contact me on Telegram at NE_X. Thank you very much.